you're very welcome to the podcast. My name is Anita Bourne and I'm the founder of the Femcast, a podcast and website driven by a passion for empowering women and promoting gender equality. Through the Femcast, we are making it our mission to educate, empower and encourage women to harness the power of their voices, share their stories and raise awareness of the crucial issues affecting women today. By amplifying women's voices, the Femcast aims to strengthen women's rights and celebrate the achievements of women everywhere. We are passionate about making a positive impact through storytelling, advocacy, and creating a supportive community to act as an inspiration to others who aspire to effect change. Come visit our website www.thefemcast.com for more information on what we do and resources to help you. In this episode of The Bullied Brain, we discuss preventable violence and the importance of teaching children values that reject violence early. We talk about recent femicides in Ireland and express our frustration at the lack of action and preventative strategies by our government. Jen talks about a study conducted in the 50s and 60s, such as Harry Harlow's research on attachment in monkeys and Anthony Bandora's Bobo doll experiment on children's imitation of aggressive behaviour. Jen emphasises the need for nurturing attachment and empathy in child development and criticises corporal punishment still being used in some American schools. We discuss the long-term impact of violence on children and the cycle of violence that can be perpetrated. We talk about healthy relationships and behaviour and setting boundaries.
Hi Jen, you're very welcome back. I'm so happy to see you, Anita. Happy New Year. Happy New Year to you too. For those listening, we're in the new year now in 2023. And when I last spoke to you, Jen, 3 women have since died, or not died, have been killed in their homes. And it's something I want to talk to you about today because I've been writing about it and tweeting about it. And I just can't get my head around why we don't, all this is preventable. The murders were preventable, the violence was preventable, the grief that's coming down the road for generations to come was all preventable. And sadly, we don't have anything in place to stop this. We're not teaching our children young, please. No violence is acceptable. We won't tolerate it. It has to be a value system that they learn every day in school, that they go in and, I don't know, we shake hands with the person beside us. And we just have a value system that respects each other, respects each other's boundaries, bodies, people, and no more violence. Yeah, it's preventable, it's heartbreaking, and it's also cyclical. And for me, as somebody who looks at the research, I find it incredibly frustrating that we don't act and we don't create laws and we don't create school lessons and interventions, and we don't work closely with young parents in order to ensure that these things don't happen. So we tend to look all the time at the downstream tragedy. 3 women were killed in their own homes in Ireland. And, just within the last 30 days. I mean, we're a very small country and small population compared to other countries. And in 2 before Christmas and 1 6 hours into the new year. Yeah. It's just so devastating. And so I want to talk today about the key research, and I want to really draw people's attention to these groundbreaking studies. And I mean, they're not new. They were I'm going to talk about 2 that were done in the 1950s and 60s. I'm going to talk about a massive international travesty that began in 1966 in Romania. Then I'm going to talk about, at the end, about research that we now have that was conducted by American doctors in the late 1990s. Now, I don't understand how it's possible that we have this research and yet we keep operating in the very, very destructive way that we do as human beings. It's got to stop. So really, let's begin with Harry Harlow. He was an American researcher who did studies of rhesus monkeys, very, very famously. He studied rhesus monkeys and he took babies. Can you imagine? Just these creatures, They are so close to humans. They, like any little creature. It's just, imagine how devastating these studies were and how cruel, basically. They were really sickening and cruel. But basically, what he learned was very important information for us when we want to look downstream and say, how is domestic violence even happening? So, what Harry Harlow found was that if he separated these babies from their mothers and he supplied them with a surrogate mother, one was a wire structure and it had a milk dispenser, and the other one was, it had rubber and terry cloth. So it was soft and tactile and had a milk dispenser. So these creatures are not being denied of shelter. They're not being denied of what they need in terms of nutrition and food that should allow them to grow up. What they were denied was their mother. And the impact on them was nothing short of horrifying. They gravitated towards the touch and the feel and the tactile sensation of the rubber terry cloth mother. The metal surrogate was like, they would have nothing to do with it. They ended up being incredibly socially unhealthy. They couldn't have romantic, or it's not romantic, but they couldn't mate properly or naturally with other monkeys. They were abusive, violent to their own babies if they even ended up having them. If a sound happened or something startled them, they would just huddle and try and cower within the cage. If they had the surrogate mother that was the rubber terry cloth one, they would be aggressive towards others that came in. And they also stared blankly. One of the defining features of them as well, if they weren't showering, they were just staring off into space. So they were completely antisocial, non-functioning, aggressive, destructive creatures because they were separated from their mother. And this was the first time that really in the sort of 60s and 70s, they started to understand just how critically important attachment to parents is, attachment to mothers, the actual physicality of a parent constantly holding their child. And there's another important study that was done later in psychology where the researcher said, the face of the parent, and he called it psychological oxygen for the child. The parent must reflect back to the child how unique they are, how valuable they are, how protected they are, how funny they are and intelligent they are. That is really what the child needs to live. Now, we tend to think children need milk and food and shelter, and they're going to be fine. That's absolutely inaccurate from a science point of view.
Well, yeah, Gabor Mate talks about that as well, about the nurturing and Indigenous people, how they brought up their children and how modern society brings up theirs. So you can see why mothers that are actually around, but that are actually not present because of the violence in their lives and what's going on, and they can't be present for the child as well. You can see how they grow into I'm not saying men, it's men and women. You can see how they grow into the people they do. Even though she may have been there, she's not there because she's worried about the violence. She's the anticipation of the violence, the next thing that's going to happen, the coercive control. You can see how, even though the children watch this and are devastated by it all round, that they do then end up having problems later.
Absolutely. So, and it's also important too to understand, parents today, with our economic situation that we're in, or with people desperately trying to flee their country, refugees and immigrants, and, trying to create a life for themselves, many parents both have to work. And the work is endless. They have to take 2 jobs, some of them. And I mean, when we do that, we don't have enough time with our children. And, we have to answer 10 emails when we get home. So instead of looking at our children and holding our children, our face is in the screen, and then our phone is ringing, and you have to look at our phone all the time. We need to know what the news is. We need to know what the next thing is coming, let alone, aggression within the home, which would be completely something that would block you from being able to relax and love and hold and attach with your child and play with your child and have these kinds of moments that are critical to their brain development. Absolutely critical. So then the next study that speaks to this is by Anthony Bandura, and it's usually referred to as the Bobo doll experiment. And it was done again in the sort of 50s, 60s. And he was looking at if children watch, very young children, 5-year-olds, if they watch an adult be aggressive, and if they watch an adult mistreating or maltreating the Bobo doll and using toys that are very aggressive. So an aggressive toy would be a mallet, for example. A non-aggressive toy would be crayons, something creative, a tea set. So what they found was absolutely children imitate adults. And we've known this for a long time, but even more intensively now with the neuroscience. We know that children are born with brains wired for empathy. And to remind everyone, empathy is when you really think about what someone else might be feeling or thinking or intending. So, Anita, going back to your point about a violent household, domestic violence, the nonviolent adult is constantly riveted on the violent one because they're trying to figure out what they next intend. What might they next do? It's terrifying, right? And so, our kids' brains are born to walk in someone else's shoes, to try and understand the world from their point of view, to essentially connect with them. And this is the root of compassion and care. So when children's empathy gets completely eroded and they start to bully and be aggressive and be harmful and be defiant and act in all these ways that are very antisocial, we have to look at ourselves as adults and go, what have we done in the home? What have we done in our schools? What have we done in our social connections whereby this child is no longer behaving naturally? Just like the rhesus monkeys, they're not behaving naturally anymore. They have been devastated mentally and brain wise because of the lack of attachment, the lack of nurture, the lack of loving, touching care from parents. So the Bobo doll, if we've got boys that are aggressive, we've got to take a look at, and as you and I talked about so many times, it's a cycle. We've got to stop the cycle at some point. So we need to stop the violent offenders and go, look, absolutely not. Sorry, you're in rehab until you can actually be with your wife, with your girlfriend, with your children, without ever laying a finger on them. You should never, ever be hurting anyone. And this includes corporal punishment for children. The research has been clear for decades that corporal punishment does nothing but hurt kids' brains. It is an absolute total negative, but it's entrenched in a whole bunch of different cultures. They believe that this is how you discipline kids. This is how you teach them. You show them consequences. It's even allowed in school systems. There's states in the United States where it's legal in a school to strike a child with a paddle. It's amazing to me. I mean, it's so divorced from research.
Wow, that's incredible because it's illegal here. Your own child.
It's illegal in Canada. Oh, in Canada, you're allowed to strike your child at home. You're just not allowed to strike a child at school.
No, they brought that in here, thankfully. That's incredible that it's still happening in some states in America.
I know. It's incredible. The statistics are shocking, but it's something like 30% of children that are corporally punished in school have to go to the hospital for their injuries.
In school? Wow.
They're hit with a paddle. They're hit with a stick. So imagine in those school systems in America, you say to children, you can't bully. We have zero tolerance for bullying. You'll be suspended. You'll be expelled. But a teacher who has all the power, or a principal or vice principal, they have all the power. They are 10,000 times your size. You've got nothing to defend yourself with. They're allowed to take a stick and hit you with it. And that's not bullying. That's discipline. That's motivation. That's consequences. Like, think of the madness of it all. You think that child is going to grow up to be a healthy partner to a woman? Probably not. They're going to identify with the aggressor. They're going to, as we all know, again, in the research, this is a typical presentation. Once you get the power, you identify with the aggressor. So you never have to feel that vulnerability and humiliation again. You reenact your own trauma over and over again until you sort it out, until you get back.
Wow. That is absolutely outrageous. And this is how then women and men who end up with violent partners tolerate it and accept it because they've grown up with it.
Well, it's imitative. I mean, so the way we raise children socially is as critically important as giving them shelter and food. It's just that we seem to be stalling as a society. We don't seem to understand that fully. And, I don't think technology has helped much. I see a lot of parents, young parents, and they're looking at their phones. They're not looking at their children. They're not walking with the stroller and talking to their child about all the different things that they see and giving them language and names to understand this incredible world around them. Their face is in their phone, and that's got to stop. Children learn empathy by studying human faces. They've got a part of the brain called the fusiform gyrus, and neuroscientists know it's incredibly important because it's quite a large portion of the brain. That's how important it is to the brain to understand what others are thinking and feeling and intending. And yet, if kids can't read their parents' faces, let alone everybody else's, they're just not going to get that really healthy development.
Yeah, and I suppose a lot of parents are still switched on after leaving the 9 to 5 job, which we know doesn't exist anymore. It's not a 9 to 5. It's a 9 to whenever you finish, and you're still taking emails and phone calls and answering text messages late into the evening over weekends.
It's not healthy. It's really not healthy for parents. It's not healthy for kids. We have to start creating some boundaries around the work, boundaries around the technology, and it's better for society as a whole. So, I mean, I absolutely agree. These kinds of downstream interventions and teachings, working with parents, working with families, working with violent offenders. I mean, there's incredible psychologists out there who, the first thing they do in the prison is they take down the sign that says, this is the meeting room for the batterers. They're like, you're not a batterer. You are a person. You're an individual. You have developed a very destructive, harmful habit. And we're not minimizing that it's terrible what you've done and that the violence is completely unacceptable. We're not minimizing, but we're going to get you better by getting you back to your actual essential self. You're not limited to just this one behavioral malfunction.
Yeah, I did a course on understanding domestic abuse and gender-based violence, and men came in to our course in university. And I know there was like a barrier there because I was thinking, why are we putting money into men? Why aren't we putting it into women's aid? We need to get more refugees because this is women are refugees themselves, leaving what they know, their home, their security, well, not so much their safety because they're leaving because they've been battered. And my tutor, I was talking to him after the class, and he was saying, like, we have to work with them. Otherwise, it's pushed underground. We can't deal with it then. More women are going to get harmed. Our job is to get people out. Our job is to get women and children out safely and rehabilitate. And I understood it then, and it actually softened my attitude with, I still am 100% with women on domestic violence and abuse, and that's, of course, control, any kind of control over a woman or anything that hurts a woman or children. But I do understand why men work, and Amen is another place, and all those other people that work around this area. And I think prevention. We drill it into teenagers going to school. Don't get pregnant. Don't try drugs. Don't do this. And yet we never say violence is not okay. And it's been around forever.
I know. I think there should be absolutely courses taught in schools to teenagers starting at 12 and 13 around what is domestic violence and what does it do to you. And you're going to have a bunch of kids in that class. If we go back to the Bobo doll experiment, there's going to be kids in that class that have been exposed to domestic violence. It's happened in their home. They've seen either their mother or most likely their father strike their other parent. And I mean, if we can't open up and have conversations about this and get families the help they need and get kids to understand that the type of trauma that they've gone through actually puts them on a very, very unhealthy trajectory, but we can get them off that path. The fact that, just as you say, Anita, we push it underground, we hide it, we're embarrassed, we don't talk about it, there's shame, there's anxiety, we don't want to hurt our dad, we don't want anyone to know what happened. It's madness. We have got to get talking about it, open about it, getting resources to the people that need the help. So going to another key research project, this was in the late 1990s. It's very well known now, not that it's made any effective changes, but it's called the ACE study. And I'm sure you and I've talked about it before. It's Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. So this was done by two American doctors, Dr. Vincent Felitti and Dr. Robert Anda, in the late 1990s. And they interviewed a massive number of people, close to 30,000 people. And what they were trying to see is their hypothesis was, can we find any kind of connection between childhood adversity, and that included domestic abuse? Can we find a connection between that and then midlife chronic health issues? So domestic abuse was one of 5 adult abuses that gave somebody an ACE score of 1. So if you've been witness to or exposed to domestic abuse, you have 1 ACE. If you had a parent or family member in your home that was suicidal, had mental health issues, anxiety, depression, these bipolar, these sorts of things, that gave you another ACE. So now you've got 2 ACEs. If there was a family member, parent that had substance abuse issues, it gave you 3. If you were sexually, physically, or emotionally abused, that gave you 4. So it goes on, or you emotional neglect. So going back to the attachment theory, you don't attach with your parent. Your parent can't show up for you for whatever reason. You get neglected. That's another ACE. And what they found was, after this massive experiment, they found that there is an absolutely direct correlation with childhood adversity. The more you had, the more chronic health issues you have in midlife. So it's very, very serious. All governments should have changed everything post this research because, developed nation countries, we can't afford our healthcare system. We don't have enough taxpayer dollars for the fact that we've got so many people with serious chronic illness in midlife. How come they are becoming so unhealthy? What I think is really important is the doctors describe this as reverse alchemy. So alchemy, just to remind people, it was a sort of a medieval idea that philosophers believed, and this was used in Harry Potter, philosophers can turn just a regular base metal into gold. So these doctors are saying, well, what we have with all the abuse children are exposed to, from 0 to 18, they are born golden. Absolutely golden potential for health, for kindness, for love, for empathy, for high performance, for everything. And our society, our homes, our schools, our sports, we turn them into lead. It's a reverse alchemy that's happening, and it's got to stop. But that was the 1990s. You and I are talking, it's 2023. What's changed?
30 years.
Just makes me crazy.
And the fact that they can relate the chronic illness in midlife that's going to take up hospital beds. You're in A&E, you can't get a doctor. We are in an absolute, excuse my language, shit show at the moment here with hospitals and people on trolleys. Can't get to see a doctor. They're going to the A&E. The A&E is packed. We have no nurses. The nurses are exhausted. The doctors are exhausted. The junior doctors are exhausted. They're leaving. Consultants can't keep up with appointments, can't get MRIs, there's no x-rays. It's just absolutely chaotic. And we have no leadership at all. So we still have crisis as well, another pandemic of violence. And in another 30, 40 years, these people, or 20 even, these people are going to be it's going to be getting worse in A&Es by the sounds of the science and the research.
Yeah, we've got the same situation medically in Canada. Our healthcare system post-COVID is in crisis. And I mean, again, these are preventable, these are preventable illnesses. And it's just, and what people don't seem to understand, this is another huge watershed research opportunity that happened. And again, it's very tragic. But in 1966, a dictator in Romania, Ceausescu, he blocked everyone from abortion and he blocked everyone from contraception. And the reason why was he wanted to up Romania's population. And he's just a psychopath, right? But we have a lot of leader psychopaths in the world right now, so it's worth talking about. Anyway, what happened was families couldn't afford all of these children. They couldn't keep them. They couldn't even feed them or care for them. So they got housed in these warehouse orphanages. Now, what you need to understand about the human brain is that it's not developed. The human brain is born not ready to go. It utterly is dependent on adults' love and care and socialization and attachment and teaching and language and you name it. children's brains, they can't even learn how to walk without adults in their world. So all these babies, again, they had shelter. Their bodies were fine. They had shelter. They had food. They had their diapers changed, and they had no loving adult connections. And they looked at their brains on brain scans. This is one of the biggest breakthroughs that the neuroscientists had with brains. And their brains were completely undeveloped. You could see right away, your brain and my brain is a developed thing. We grew up in households where we were loved and cared for and talked to and nurtured and given psychological oxygen by our parents. And then in our schools, well, we have high functioning brains that are healthy and light up. These people don't. It's tragic.
Yeah, I remember doing that in college when I was doing counselling skills, and the babies died by 18 months and 3 years from not being nurtured. They were still fed every day. They were fed the same meals, changed, but they were just left there in their cots. That is horrendous. But that's that they died because they got no love, and that their little bodies just gave up. Oh,
it's just horrendous. It's so tragic. Now, okay, we've had the worst conversation ever. Let's look at the positive. Now, the key thing that we also know about brain science, as you and I have talked about before, is that the brain, just like the body, is innately wired to repair and restore. So, yeah, our health system's going crazy. Well, why don't we take agency from it? In the 1980s, we learned that if we committed to fitness, we could completely change our own health trajectory. We didn't need a doctor to do everything for us. We actually could empower ourselves to get out walking and running and playing sports and bicycling and so on and so forth. And it was incredibly good for us. We now know too that getting out in nature is one of the healthiest things you can do for your brain and your body. We also now know that the brain itself, like the Romanian example, is extreme, very, very extreme. And, a child exposed to a great deal of violence, it's going to be hard work for that brain to unlearn it. Very hard work. Doesn't mean it's impossible. It's absolutely possible. Every single one of us has a kind of brain and a neuroplasticity, which means the brain's ability to change based on environment and based on what we practice. So if I was an incarcerated individual who'd been very violent to my children or to my partner, and there I am, well, I can commit to a rehabilitation program. I can give it my all. And if you looked at my brain after an intensive year of practicing daily healthy things like empathy and compassion and care, I would have rewired my brain, and you could see it on a brain scan. I would have a completely different brain after 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year. And I could leave the jail and I could go out and be the best mom or dad out there. It can happen, but it's really hard work. It takes discipline and it takes coaching and support, and you have to make mistakes over and over again and then reset the brain over and over and over again.
Well, that's how I found your book, researching how to get better after I had a bullied brain and I got sick from work. So I had to get up every day and I had to work at it. It is consistency, it is discipline, and it is hard work. And the days you just want to lie there and just not do anything, see anyone, talk to anyone, are the days you really have to get up and do it. Yeah. And it is hard work, but I'm so glad it turns around, because I was just incredibly sad, as well as I felt so broken. And I just thought I will never be that. I'll never get back to the way I was, but here I am.
Yeah. No, and in actual fact, I think what you demonstrate too is many people, when they commit to that discipline and they force themselves to get up out of bed and they put their clothes on, and even if it's 5 minutes, they do their brain training for 5 minutes, then they get back into bed. That 5 minutes becomes 7 minutes. That 7 minutes becomes 15, and you just keep pushing and doing it. And you change your neural networks, and you all of a sudden you cross that line. One of the researchers describes what you're saying as activation energy, and it's really hard. But activation energy is what ignites your brain, makes it get up, makes it do what it has to do. And then the beautiful moment happens where it starts to become your default neural network. You can't wait to get out of bed. You can't wait to see your friends. You can't wait to do your job and your work. You feel positive and encouraged and excited. That once that happens, to turn it around and push it back into despair and feeling broken would be just as hard, right? So the brain, like, you can tip which way it goes through hard work, and you can come back even stronger.
Mhm. And it does work for anyone listening. It really does work. And it does get better. I know I didn't believe it myself. I was very skeptical. I kept saying, and I was so tired all the time and exhausted. And every part of me ached. I had pains and aches everywhere. And I just felt so heavy in my chest. My head felt heavy. It felt like it was just weighed a ton on my body. Everything just felt stagnant and heavy. And then one day you start feeling lighter. And the next day it gets a little lighter and lighter and lighter. And one day you just get up and it just has fallen away and you feel stronger. And it does work. So don't despair if you're listening and you think you won't get better. You do.
That is such a eloquent description of what it's like to pull out of a depression. And as you know, Anita, from the book, I mean, I started working on that book out of a severe depression because my student had committed suicide. And I couldn't cope anymore. I was lost. I was so full of despair and felt that the system was designed to be uncaring and cruel. And it wasn't protecting our young people, even though that's all it ever talks about. I couldn't stand the hypocrisy of it. I couldn't get my brain to believe anymore in the world. I lost all faith. And really, again, you go to that dark night of the soul. And if there's, you know, what brought me back in many ways is not only, I have 2 children of my own and I had to fight for them, but kids. I'll fight for kids. I'll fight for the little boys that are becoming aggressive in their home and they're imitating horrible adult behaviors. And I'll fight for the girls that are getting hurt and they're being mistreated and they're being exposed to all kinds of abuses. And, it's same as you. I mean, this is why you and I click and connect. Is both of us, there's something fighting within us, a desire for something better. And we can believe in that.
What did a neuroscientist say about depression and how the brain is going through it?
One of the most interesting things I've read is the work of Lisa Feldman Barrett. And what she says our brains evolved, and they're so incredibly complex, but they evolved, throughout the centuries in order to manage the body budget. So our bodies are made up of these incredibly complex systems, and the brain is sort of the manager of that. So, it's so interesting the way she talks about it. So, for example, if you are working in an office or you're a student at school or you're an athlete and you have a teacher or a coach or a boss who's threatening, they might be very aggressive, they might be a bully, they might be unfair, they might put you down or humiliate you in front of your peers. She says that will affect your body budget. When you feel stress, the brain, it burns up a bunch of resources, right? And then the brain and the body are always trying to get back to balance or homeostasis. So how could you recover from the fact that when you see this individual, it takes a whack, it takes a whole bunch of energy out of you, a bunch of your resources? You can regain those resources through exercise, through really good sleeping, through nutritional food, maybe through social, emotional contact and connection with people who love you and you love them. So these are ways that we balance the body budget. And the brain is like, fine, good, that's working. Now let's imagine that this individual, let's say it's a boss or a teacher or coach, but a parent, a domestically abusive parent. Imagine a figure in your life. Your body budget gets out of whack and the brain does not have time. It can't keep up. It can't balance the resources, and the bodies and the brain together start getting more and more and more out of control. The budget is totally in a deficit. There's not enough resources because you're daily dealing with this onslaught, this fear, this pain, this hurt, this humiliation. Like You can't keep up. This is why bullying and abuse, these types of things, are just so devastating to our physical health and to our mental health. Physically devastating to our brains. You can see on a brain scan the damage, the neurological scars left by this type of stuff. So that type of bullying and abusive behavior, it's got your entire system out of whack. And your brain, I'm going to parent this. It can't keep you healthy and safe. It knows you're in danger from this individual, and it doesn't have to be physical. It can be psychological danger. The kinds of bullying that we see in the workplace. You can't slap someone across the face, but you can do massive psychological damage to someone and get away with it oftentimes. And it's normalized in a lot of cultures. Same thing in sports and schools. So what the brain decides is that the body is in so much danger that it's got to just shut it down. And then you have depression. So the body curls up into the most protective, most resource containing. The brain thinks that you're like out in the desert. It thinks you're exposed to predators. It thinks that if you don't get into the cave and you don't crawl underground and you don't pull the cover over your head and stay as still as humanly possible, you're not going to survive. And this is why it's hard to get out of depression, because you've got to find ways to communicate to your brain that actually you're safe. And if you live in domestic violence, you're not. So if you have to go to work every day and you have an abusive boss, you're not safe. So you can well imagine, like, brain and body trying to navigate this crisis. Depression's a pretty smart solution to keeping you alive.
Yeah, you never look at depression like that. It's always as a negative, but it's actually telling your body, I can't do this anymore. You have got to pull back and retreat and just go into that fetal position and get well. That's incredible, isn't it?
Anita, I love the way you put that, because really many things that when I look back on my life, I feel thankful to my brain. I understand that my brain did it. Like, I was abused as a child by teachers, not by my parents. Over the course of 13 to 17, there were 3 teachers that were highly abusive in my school, and they abused many students. And I dissociated. So the way I coped as a teenage girl was to just cut off the trauma of the abuse. I tried not to look at it. I put it away in a box. I couldn't understand it. And it was very traumatizing. So I just kept it hidden from myself. Like, I blocked it off, and I went off to university and did all my stuff and became a teacher and whatever. And then ultimately, of course, the dissociated part of myself, as it does, kind of blew up, and I had to deal with it as an adult. But my brain waited until I was strong enough. It said, you know what? We're not touching this thing. You can't deal with it. You can't look at it. You're not strong enough. And then when I became strong enough, it said, okay, together, let's go. We're going to open this box. We're going to do a deep dive. It's going to be incredibly painful. And I know that you can cope. You're strong enough. You're resilient. We're going to do this. And we're going to come out of it 10,000 times stronger. And then we're going to be able to advocate so that this does not ever happen to other children.
The brain is so magical and incredible, isn't it? It's just magical.
It's magical.
It truly is. And I don't know if you believe, science or God or whoever created it, they were very clever.
One of the loveliest things that I think about the brain, and especially when I think about the divine, I mean, for me, my sense of the divine is I've always gravitated towards it. Like, when I studied for my PhD, I did all this work on Dante's Divine Comedy. Like, I love that world. I don't go to a church in a regular way, but I'm a deeply sort of spiritual person. I believe there's something bigger. I believe it's mysterious and miraculous. So when I think about how, the idea that God made humanity in his or her image, people tend to think like, oh, the human body. I don't think that's true. I think what that means is God, as we can understand it as best we can with our limited human understanding, the divine is actually more like the galaxy. It's like the universe. It's like the stars. Well, what do you think the human brain looks like? When neuroscientists go to describe the human brain, the only analogy or comparison they can use to share with us what it's like is to say that our 86 billion neurons, our 86 billion brain cells that are electrical, they're stars. That's the closest thing to the galaxy that we know. The brain and the galaxy, the divine and the human, they reflect one another. And that's why it's kind of a beautiful thing for us to start to learn more about our brains and work with our brains, not against them. Our potential is just, sky's the limit.
Yeah, and just turning around the depression into a positive, that the brain is protecting us. Because before that, if you rewind to before we go into that, it's the hypervigilance, it's the fight or flight, it's the freeze as well, and it's that constant cycle of what's coming, what's coming, what's coming, and then just one day you just can't do it anymore. And people know, like I did, I looked at it as a negative, but now I think it's a beautiful positive. That it was just like a no, and I went away and healed.
Yeah.
It's brilliant.
Yeah. I mean, the fight or flight too. I mean, really, it's kind of sad because with fight or flight and freeze, the body, of course, and the brain are working together double time to get us to safety. They're trying to get us to the place where we can heal, right? They're trying to either make us freeze so that the predator, the intraspecies predator, which is a very creepy term that's used when researchers are talking about human beings that hurt other human beings, that target other human beings, they call them intraspecies predators. In other words, they prey on their own kind. And this is what abusive individuals do. So if you're dealing with an intraspecies predator and you're trying to freeze so they don't see you, you're trying to run away, flee, or you have to fight them in order to survive. Again, your brain is just doing everything it can. It's working really closely with your body to help you survive. That's what it does. But in the 21st century, like, let's go back to the kind of stress that parents are under, for example. Like domestic abuse, oftentimes there's links between, the person, the abusive or the violent person loses their job, or they suffer an extreme humiliation of some kind, or they are somebody fights them. And it becomes this sort of, all of the negatives, if fight is your default, because that's the way you got through your childhood, it showing aggression and manifesting violence is the way that you survive. Your brain thinks that that's the best strategy for you. It is trying to help you live. It doesn't know that you're the aggressor and that you're actually victimizing people who can fight back, who are actually close to you. So the brain, it has its incredible advances to it, and yet it's really the mind that has to manage the brain. The brain is a great power, but the mind always has to mindfully make these kinds of decisions. So let's say,
So you're going to have to explain that.
Okay. So yeah. Okay. One of the ways I think about this is, and I use this when I talk to young people, is if you're learning how to drive or you're a young driver, you always keep the brain as the engine. It's the engine of your car, but it's never in the driver's seat. Okay. Only the mind. The mind is the one that makes the decisions. The brain is the power. So let's look at that in a domestic violence situation. Let's say I get publicly humiliated at work, and I feel an enormous amount of rage and pain. And I can't fight back against my boss who publicly shamed me and fired me because I don't have any power. And I'm in a poverty situation, and I grew up that way. And the only way I survived my tough neighborhood and my violent parenting situation was by fighting back. As soon as I started to fight back, I was a lot safer, right? I wasn't as a kid, I was hit. I was hit by my teachers, I was hit by my parents. But when I got the power, I learned that never again, no one would ever hit me again. So I take all of that bundle. That's the brain, right? The brain is going, fight is the method to survive. Cortisol and adrenaline are pumping. You walk in the door of the home in that state, and your brain is in charge, and it's telling you that fight is what's going to keep you alive. It's what's kept you alive since you were 16 and you got powerful and strong. It's going to be the way that you push back against all the hurt and harm and shame that you suffered through your childhood. And explosion. You take it out on your very vulnerable wife and children. Okay. So what that person needs to learn is that, yeah, fight is your default. It helped you survive. Your brain was doing its best to keep you alive in a very violent home, neighborhood, and school. But that's no way to lead your life. That is no way to establish a loving relationship with your wife or your children? What does the mind teach you to do? And you have to practice. Going back to what you said about discipline, mindfulness does not happen in a day. It's incredibly hard work. But the research is very clear. You can see it on a brain scan. The most advanced brains, in terms of this informed decision making, this space between stimulus, I got fired at work and shamed, and response, I'm going to go home and hit my wife. The mindful person creates an enormous amount of space between those two things. So that's the fight response. I and you are more freeze and flight. We run away from confrontation. I've never hit a person in my life. I wouldn't know how to punch someone if I was paid. I really don't. But that's because I was privileged enough to grow up where I wasn't being hit. It's not. I come by my ignorance. Honestly, it's not. I'm not a better person than a person who resorts to violence. I just didn't experience it. The Bobo doll, the imitation of violent human interaction, was not in my world. If I'd been a different kid in a different neighborhood, in a different family, at a different school, that might have been different. So you see, it's not. I'm not good, and the violent person's bad. It's however you were raised. It's whatever you were exposed to. What we can say, though, as adults, is all of us have the opportunity to choose the mindful path. We don't have to have the stimulus of shame or pain or humiliation and have a reaction. We don't have to be reactive individuals. Instead, we can create space, mindful, breathing, thinking, deep mind experience space between shame happened at work. What will we do? We'll go home. We will sit down with our partner. We'll tell the kids to keep playing and have fun, and we're going to go out for dinner. Sit down with our partner, and we'll tell them what happened and how horrible it was. And then plan together and strategize together about how to recover as a team. Yeah, that's mine.
So the mind is in the driver's seat. The brain is in the back seat. So when the brain is in that situation where it's like, I need to punch a wall, I need to punch something, the mind goes, no, you don't. You need to calm down and take a deep breath.
Yep.
How do we help somebody and, that moment where they just turn? It takes practice.
It takes practice. So going back to like you described your description of getting out of depression. If you have violence, so your reaction was flight, the most extreme form of flight, which was to retreat from the world completely, just disappear, right? Crawl into bed and not get out. That's flight. If you're someone who has fight and you're aggressive and violent, and that's your default go-to position, then you can use the same day in, day out. So you had to get rid of heaviness and this weighted sense that you were basically never going to feel joy or happiness or connection again. Okay, imagine you're the violent person. You have to train yourself daily to, when you feel that impulse to protect yourself and to create safety through aggression, you've got to start creating space between that stimulus, the stimulus of, someone just shamed me, or I dropped the hammer on my foot, or I just got fired and I'm terrified. I don't know how I'm going to support my wife and kids. Any of those types of things, you feel the impulse, like the depressive impulse is you feel like you just pull the covers over your head and you don't want to talk to anybody. When you're the aggressive person, you feel the impulse to lash out. Well, you have to start deep breathing. Maybe you use exercise. When you feel that feeling, you got to start moving. You got to burn off that excess impulse by lots of movement, going for a jog, like going and working out with a punching bag, like kickboxing. Do what you need to do to release that energy, but also recognize that the last thing you ever want to do is bring that energy to someone else. That's not fair.
Yeah. Like we've spoken before, Jen, about bringing it to schools and bringing it to children as early as possible, do no harm to others, respect them, have boundaries, show loving kindness. What to teach you when you do yoga. Actually, yoga would be amazing if they had that for half an hour every day in school, and mindfulness, and have this teaching about the brain. We're only two people. How do we change? How do we even start, or where do we start to get it out there? The science, first of all, you have that in the book. How do we appeal to governments and teachers and the Department of Education to say, why aren't we doing this in school for prevention? To keep women and girls safe, and young boys and children, and keep, because it is mostly men that are doing prison time. It's 96, 98% for domestic violence. So keep them out of prison. It's to stop all the illnesses in midlife and hospital beds free. How do you go about change?
Well, back in the day, there have been scientific revolutions, right? It's happened. We used to believe that the Earth was the center of the universe and then the sun was orbiting around us. We don't believe that anymore. We used to think that the Earth was flat, and if you walked to the edge of it, you would fall off. Most of us, anyways, vast majority of us don't believe that anymore. We're at a point where we have a huge amount of research that tells us that really we have to start prioritizing brain health, understanding how our brains work the way they do, and using that as a way to address social problems that have been around for far too long, and that we have all the knowledge that we need to change them. It's really like, if you think about prison, it's just like the most old-fashioned, destructive, outdated system on the planet. It's an absolute last resort. And we put so many resources into last resort, downstream things like prison. When if we invested upstream into families, into parenting, into health, into knowledge, into care and mindfulness and yoga and all those things that you just described, if families could say, look, we have a domestic abuse situation that's just starting out here. We really need help. We need intervention. We need professional support. Please come and help us. That's where we should be putting the money, not into putting a guy in a cell and locking the door like Harry Harlow's rhesus monkeys. It's crazy. So, we all have to work at it. You're doing a huge amount of work, shining a spotlight on these issues right there.
Yeah, but I'm only one person. I love a miracle because it's been around my life, all my life. I grew up in it, and I've just met loads of women coming up along. I'm lucky that I don't have that anymore in my life, and I haven't had it in 30 odd years, but I have met so many women that are suffering through it, and it's actually painful even when you're out of it, because you know what they're going through, the fear, the anxiousness. And I don't know how the moms are doing it. I don't know how the women do a day's work. They go home after a heavy day of responsibility, and then they have to switch it on for children, and they have to spend the time with the kids. They don't know what's coming. The weekends they probably dread, holidays. There's always the big campaigns around Christmas. It is the most frightening time of the year, and it doesn't seem to be getting better.
It's an abject failure in leadership, really. It just shouldn't happen, and there should be swift and effective measures when it does. There should be a hotline that you call the second it's happening. The person just needs to be removed who's violent, and they need to stay somewhere else. You can't come home. You don't go home. There's so many different campaigns that could change this kind of thinking. Here's an example. When the governments learned that smoking cigarettes was correlated with cancer, our entire society changed. So I'm older than you, but when I was growing, smoking was the most normal thing on the planet. Your doctor smoked, your parents smoked, your grandparents smoked. You smoked on planes, you smoked in restaurants, you smoked in bars, you smoked at work, you smoked at school. Smoking was normal. Well, it's not anymore. And why is that? Because the government put in a massive campaign to stop smoking from being normalized. You can't buy a carton of cigarettes without having to look at tar-blackened cancerous lungs. How come we are still doing the big fairy tale romance, marriage, this and that, without showing women, hey, look, here's the beautiful bride. You're spending all your time thinking about your wedding dress. This is the picture of a woman who was beaten by her husband. Do you know if the man you're marrying has violent tendencies? Do you know his background? Do you know, has he ever touched you before? Has he ever lost his temper? Has he ever punched his fist into the wall? You're in the honeymoon phase. Are you going to be dependent on this guy? Because the second you're dependent, he has control over you. Control and coercion don't happen by accident. They happen through dependence. What's your backup plan if this guy's violent? How come we're not doing that? The government is responsible to do that. The government is responsible to day in, day out, hammer in legislation. I'm not allowed to smoke at work. I'm not allowed to smoke in school. How is it that a person is allowed to go into a home and violently harm their partner and children? First time that happens, done.
You've done it with drink driving as well. People used to get into cars and not give it a second thought. Now you never find anybody doing that.
Exactly.
And the next day, we have it's drummed into us now. You can't even drive the next day if you've drank the night before. So we don't.
Exactly. Because there's repercussions, there's consequences.
And I think that's it. It's consequences. Like, we don't teach them. We don't teach people, if you're going to do that, there's consequences, because they've gotten away with it for so long.
Well, it's even worse. It's like normalized. Like when I was writing The Bullied Brain, as you know, I hit a certain point where I realized our society believes, it really does believe, that abuse is a necessary evil for greatness. So it's okay to abuse children because it's going to make them tougher, more resilient, have grit, be greater, be stronger, be more high performing. We believe that. And until we debunk that myth, which is absolutely grounded in nothing, there's no research behind it, zero. And that's why I use the science. I'm like, if people want to keep believing these falsehoods, well, how do we debunk the myth? How do we teach them that it's actually not true? Give them the science and then make a decision.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, before we would have went into jobs and just put up with it as well. If you use me for an example, you don't realize the abuse is abuse, whether it's in the home or it's in the job or it's in the school or it's on the basketball court. Abuse is abuse.
Yeah.
It still has the same effect on your body and your brain and the trauma you carry. But we always just put it into the home.
Mm-hmm. I know. And, you talk to people, and even the most advanced professions, the most educated, most privileged people, like in law and medicine, those training programs are constructed on absolutely bullying premises. The doctors bully the young doctors learning. The lawyers bully the young lawyers coming up through the system. It's incredible. It's just like our society is steeped in it. But we used to be steeped in smoking and, like you say, drunk driving, and we're not anymore. So it's up to governments. I think lobbying the government, is really worthwhile. I mean, there's movement afoot. That is for sure in Canada. There's movement afoot in America right now. There's a psychological workplace bill that's being fought for in Oregon. And it's very funny. They're using the bully brain to make their case. They're saying the science says that psychological abuse in the workplace is as bad as physical. Put in laws to protect us, the workers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I read that. I read that last week. Congratulations. That's amazing.
Yeah. Well, let's hope that we can do it. And then I think then it just gets the ball rolling and change happens. And,
Thank you for joining us on the Femcast. We invite you now to stay connected with us by hitting the subscribe buttons below and follow us across our social media channels at the Femcast. We value your feedback and reviews. By sharing ideas, insights and experiences, we can all learn, grow and make a meaningful difference. We also want to remind you that we care about your well-being. If any topics discussed on today's episode have raised concerns or you need support, please visit our website www.thefemcast.com for helpful resources and phone numbers. Thank you for being part of the Femcast.